Hello, Mr. Hardy here, and in this video I would like to teach you about part 7 of An Inspector Calls by J.B. Priestley, Inspector Goole's speech. As per usual, you need to have read, watched or studied this part of the play before, and you could be using this video to revise for an upcoming assessment or to gain a deeper analytical understanding of what's going on. As per usual, I'll start by looking at what happens in this section. We'll explore the key characters, themes, context and quotes, and I'll leave you with an exam-style question you can answer if you want to get some writing practice in. So, what happens in part 7 An Inspector Calls speech? Now remember, the play An Inspector Calls by J.B. Priestley is in 3 acts. I'm just subdividing it into multiple smaller parts to make it easier to analyse. So in this section, I'm going from where Inspector Goole says stop to the stage direction he walks straight out. The he here is Inspector Goole's himself when he leaves the stage. By this point of the play, Inspector Goole has interrogated the entire Burling family, Arthur, Sybil, Sheila and Eric, and he has also interrogated Gerald Croft as well. At this stage, the Burlings are bickering amongst themselves. Gerald Croft is actually off stage, he's left the stage, and Inspector Goole sort of loses his cool and he says stop, and he takes charge of the situation and he delivers his famous final speech. He starts by placing social responsibility for Eva Smith's death upon the Burlings. He actually says each of you helped kill her. So he directs the blame not just at one person, personal responsibility, he directs it at the whole Burling family, so social responsibility. Inspector Goole then reminds each of the Burlings what they did to Eva Smith. So he starts with Mrs. Burling and he said that she turned her away when Eva needed help. The exact quote is, "You turned her away when she most needed help." Inspector Goole then reminds Eric that he used Eva for, and I quote, a stupid drunken evening. Sheila doesn't need reminding, she openly admits her contribution to Eva Smith's demise, which of course was she got her fired from Millwoods. Though Mr. Burling doesn't admit it, so Inspector Goole has to turn on him and say, "You started it," and point the blame at him. Even though Gerald's off stage, Inspector Goole still refers to him and says, well, at least he made Eva Smith happy for a time, even though he did ultimately dump her when he was done with her. After he's reminded all of the Burlings and Gerald, who's not on stage, of what they did to Eva Smith, he begins his final and famous speech. And in this speech, he is a mouthpiece for Priestley. This is a really common phrase that students who write about An Inspector Calls should use. What this means is that Priestley can't walk on the stage and give a speech to his audience as J.B. Priestley. That wouldn't make any sense. So what he does is he writes himself in as a character. I think Inspector Goole is basically J.B. Priestley himself. So when Inspector Goole speaks, it's basically Priestley speaking, and through this technique, through using Inspector Goole as a mouthpiece, Priestley can share his thoughts directly with his post-war British audience. And his thoughts are all about advocating socialism and criticising capitalism. So here is the famous final speech. I've typed it out in full and I'll read it to you. But just remember this. One Eva Smith is gone, but there are millions and millions and millions of Eva Smiths and John Smiths still left with us, with their lives, their hopes and fears, their suffering and chance of happiness all intertwined with our lives and what we think and say and do. We don't live alone. We are members of one body. We are responsible for each other. And I tell you that the time will soon come when if men will not learn that lesson, then they will be taught it in fire and blood and anguish. Good night. So I've underlined what I consider are some of my key quotes from this speech. I won't go over it now, I'll go over it in more detail in the quotes section later on in the video. So let's look at the main character of the moment, which is of course Inspector Goole. Inspector Goole is Priestley's mouthpiece, as I mentioned earlier. He speaks on behalf of Priestley. And as I mentioned earlier, Inspector Goole advocates socialism. He wants to promote it. Throughout the play, Inspector Goole comes across as someone who is concerned with his duty, so he's morally bound to do the right thing. And according to him, his duty is to find out the truth about what happened to Eva Smith. And you can actually go one step further and to hold those responsible, to hold the Burling family responsible for what they've done. Inspector Goole creates an impression of massiveness, solidity and purposefulness. I've taken this from the stage directions at the start of the play in Act 1. Massiveness doesn't necessarily mean his physical size. I think he represents a massive idea, socialism, an idea that could change the face of Britain. Again, solidity doesn't mean that, he's tangible, you could touch him. I think the idea he represents, socialism, is a solid idea. Priestley thinks it's a good idea for Britain. And purposefulness. Priestley's play is written for a purpose, to promote socialism, and this is reflected in his mouthpiece, Inspector Goole. Inspector Goole doesn't mince his words, he doesn't beat around the bush, he's very focused, he's very purposeful, and I think that reflects socialism. Socialists had a purpose, they wanted to change Britain for the better. Inspector Goole leaves the Burlings staring, subdued and mourning. So again, I've gone for three pieces of information we find in stage directions. Now these are the stage directions after Inspector Goole has left and the Burlings are staring. So they're sort of stunned, they're shocked by the inspector. So this capitalist family is shocked by the socialist ideas that he's bringing. They are left subdued. So at the start of the play, the Burlings were quite arrogant in their capitalism. Sheila was marrying Gerald, business was going well, Mr. Burling didn't think there'd be a war. Now they're left a bit sorry for themselves, like a dog with a tail between its legs. They're subdued, they're thinking about all the things that went wrong. And finally, they're mourning. Mourning with a U means you're grieving for someone who's died or something that's lost. And I think they're mourning perhaps for Eva Smith. I imagine Eric and Sheila are mourning for Eva Smith. Maybe Arthur and Sybil are mourning over the loss of their reputation, this idea of a scandal happening. But they're left feeling sad. So socialism has shed a light on their corrupt capitalism, and now they're left feeling sorry for themselves. To go back to another dog reference, maybe they're licking their wounds. Inspector Goole may be a characteronym for the word ghoul, suggesting a supernatural quality. So in previous videos we looked that Eva Smith might be a characteronym, Eva being like Eve, like Adam and Eve, representing women, and Smith being the most common name in the surname in the British Isles, which represents like the working class. So Eva Smith represents all working class women. Here Goole suggests a ghostly or a supernatural figure. And the way Inspector Goole conducts himself, he seems to know more than the rest of the Burlings. He has access to Eva Smith's diary, and of course, as Priestley's mouthpiece, he knows everything that's going on. He's almost like an omniscient character. So maybe this name Goole you could analyse as a characteronym for some sort of supernatural, omniscient quality, and that's reflected in the way Inspector Goole conducts his affairs on stage. So, thematically, I want to look at socialism and social responsibility. Now, I have looked at both of these in previous and Inspector Goule's analytical videos, but I want to bring them back because they really tie in with Inspector Goole perfectly. And if you have an exam question with Inspector Goole in it, you must write about socialism and social responsibility. It just makes sense. So as I've previously mentioned, Inspector Goole is Priestley's mouthpiece, and the aim is for him to advocate socialism, because Priestley believes that socialism is the cure that post-war Britain needed. Just a quick reminder, capitalism is the idea that business production is owned privately. So for example, if I have Mr. Hardy's pen factory that produces pens, I can determine how much I sell the pens for, I can determine how much I pay my workers because I'm the owner, and that way I can make as much profit as possible, and I'm really happy. However, socialism believes that production should be owned equally by society. So even though I run Mr. Hardy's pen factory, I don't actually own it. It's owned by the government or the state, and my profits is shared more equally than it would be in capitalism. So I don't get to choose how much I sell the pens for, I don't get to choose how much to pay my workers, that is all controlled centrally. So as an imaginary pen business owner, I love capitalism because I can make a lot of profit, but I don't like socialism because I have to share out my wealth. Whereas if you are the working class and you're working in one of my pen factories, You wouldn't like it if we lived in a capitalist society, because I'd end up paying you very little, but you would like it if we lived in a socialist society, because you'll be getting a fairer pay for your contribution. Britain historically was, and still is, a largely capitalist society. We believe in private business and generating profit, which is what makes us a really strong economy, not just in Europe, but worldwide. However, there are elements of socialism in Britain. This happened actually around the time the play was set. So the play was set in 1912, and we call this the Edwardian era. Around then, the liberal reforms were happening. You'll have to talk to a history teacher to get the exact dates. I think it's 1906 to 1916, something like that. But there was a period at the start of the 1900s where Britain was introducing support for the working classes and the poor. And some of that still exists today. So the socialist elements in modern Britain include a welfare state. So if you can't work, for example, for disability, you get supported by the government. A state healthcare system, the NHS, where you don't have to pay if you can't, but you still can access medical care if you need it. These are more socialist ideas. So you could argue that Britain, even though it is largely capitalist, there are elements of socialism. So Priestley, his play, has instigated some change that we can see in our modern day Britain. Social responsibility, I've talked about it earlier. It's an idea that everyone in society looks out for one another, everyone's responsible for one another, and everyone is linked, and all actions have consequences for others. For example, if as a business owner for Mr. Hardy's pen factory, I decide to give my workers a pay cut, my action affects them because they all now have less money on which to survive. But let's say my workers go on strike and they don't show up to work, then their actions affect me because I can no longer meet my quotas for selling pens to companies. So it's this idea that everyone is linked, and as a result we shouldn't divide each other based on class or based on gender or anything like that. We should look after each other and treat each other equally, and these are quite socialist ideas. You can remember it this way: socialism, social responsibility, both have the word social in them, so you can connect them together when you write your essay. So with this thematic knowledge, just reread Inspector Goole's final speech and think about how his words promote socialism and this idea of social responsibility. So contextually speaking, I want to give you more information about the writer himself, J.B. Priestley. J.B. stands for John Boynton. John Boynton Priestley was born in 1894 in Yorkshire. He witnessed poverty in Yorkshire's working classes. I think it was a mining community he was quite familiar with, and he criticised how the upper classes behaved. So the working classes really struggled. It was a physically demanding job. They weren't paid much, but the upper classes seemed to ignore that. They seemed to live their grand, fancy lives, and this really irritated Priestley. Priestley grew up with a lot of socialist views, mainly from his father and his father's friends. They all were politically aligned towards the ideology of socialism. Priestley ended up serving during World War I, and I think that was quite a harrowing experience for him. I think he served on the front line. He probably saw lots of friends die and suffer during the war, and I'm pretty sure that would change a man. Returning from the war, he studied at Cambridge University, so a very famous university. He was clearly a very smart academic man. And he became an essayist, a novelist, and a radio broadcaster. He was probably most famous for his radio broadcasts, which people tuned into on the radio, and that was a good platform for him to share his political ideas. In fact, he was so politically focused, he co-founded a political party called the Commonwealth Party. You don't need all of this information to write an essay on an Inspector Calls, but it might give you some context that you could dip into and add extra marks into your writing if you bring up some of this knowledge, that he grew up with socialist views, that he used the radio to also broadcast his socialist ideas, things like that. So in this section, Inspector Goole's speech, what are the key quotes you should commit to memory and bring up in an exam if you are given the opportunity? But each of you helped to kill her. Inspector Goole says this, and you can easily link this to social responsibility. You can't even say, "I'm sorry, Eva Smith." Inspector Goole says this, and it builds this idea of regret or guilt, that the start of change is regretting your past actions or feeling guilty about them. So if Inspector Goole can make this capitalist family, the Burlings, feel regret or guilt over how they treated Eva Smith, that emotion might provide the change for them to change from capitalistic ideas to socialistic ideas. There are millions and millions and millions of Eva Smiths and John Smiths. This quote from an Inspector Goole, you could pick up on the technique of exaggeration or triple. You could look at the triple, millions, 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 or you could look at the exaggeration. This is where my inability to do maths will show up. A million times a million is a trillion. A trillion times a million is something, but it's a very large number. So this quote is basically suggesting there's a large number of Eva Smiths who represents all working class women through a character nim technique, and John Smith, who I assume would represent all working class men. So the point Priestley's trying to get across at is there is a huge amount of working class people in England who need the help of the upper classes to lead better lives. Speaking of the working classes, Inspector Goole says their lives, their hopes and fears, their suffering and chance of happiness. So there's a list going on here. He lists lives, hopes, fears, suffering, happiness. It really drives home this idea that all aspects of life are linked to how you treat each other. If the upper classes treat the working classes well, not only do they get paid more, but their whole life improves. They can start having hopes for their children, they have less fears, they suffer less, they increase in happiness. So it's not just a case of money, which is what capitalism wants you to focus on. It's a case of the human being, the well-being of people, of humanity. And that's what socialism focuses more on. We are members of one body, Inspector Goole says this, and this is a biblical allusion. That means it's taken from the Bible, the Christian holy text. And if you want to find it, you could look it up. It's in 1 Corinthians chapter 12, verse 12, and there is the verse about all of humans belonging to one body. And what it's worth noting is that in the Edwardian era, when the play was set, 1912, Britain was largely Christian, and actually in post-war Britain, so when the play was performed in 1945, Britain was also a largely Christian country. In more modern times that's declined, but in the times the play was set and written, it was a reference that most people would have understood, most people would have got. We are responsible for each other. Inspector Goole says this, and this is quite easy to link to the theme of responsibility. It's literally got the word responsible in the quote. You can then identify that as a theme. You could link it to other parts in the play, maybe where Mr. Burling doesn't accept responsibility, where Sheila does accept responsibility. It's always a good idea to bring in themes into your essay if you can. And the final quote I want to look at is fire and blood and anguish. Here we have a triple, it's said by Inspector Goole, and I think there's dual meaning here. So Inspector Goole says if we don't learn our lesson, if we keep going down this capitalistic path, our society will end in fire, blood and anguish. That could be a reference to hell, bearing in mind that the Edwardian and the post-war British society were largely Christian, as I just mentioned. This idea that if you lead a bad life on earth, when you make it to the afterlife, God will send you to hell, and in the hell there are pits of fire and sulphur, and that's what you can link to fire. There will be, torture perhaps, and that might link to blood, and in hell, if you're constantly being burnt and tortured, I'm pretty sure you will suffer anguish, you will be in pain. But not only that, I think it could also refer to very real things that happen on this earth, such as war, in particular World War I and World War II. World War I happened just after the play is set, and World War II just finished when the play was being performed. So Priestley lived through both of these wars, and he saw the fire that would have been caused by bombing. He saw the blood that would have been caused by bullets. He saw the anguish of his fellow friends dying on the front line, the anguish of returning home and mothers no longer having sons and wives no longer having husbands. And he saw that all of this, in his opinion, came from differences, saying that people were of different countries, different class, whereas he thought the cure to this, to avoiding war, to avoiding hell, would be seeing people as equal, more socialist idea. So, what can you do? You can make notes from this video on a physical copy of the play. You could also try answering this exam style question. If this comes up as an exam question, you should laugh, because this would be the easiest exam question in the world. But why did J.B. Priestley write the play An Inspector Calls? So here I want you to look at a bit of context of Priestley that I've taught you in this video. I definitely want you to bring in ideas of social responsibility and socialism. I think you should focus on Inspector Goole and the message he's trying to get across, and pick out some of the quotes we've covered, and produce an essay with an introduction, a couple of bodies of analysis, and a conclusion about why Priestley wrote this play. What is the purpose of it? What change did he want to inspire, and why? If you found this video useful, please give it a like. Please consider subscribing to my channel for more English literature videos, and feel free to leave a comment if you think I missed out anything. Well, thank you for your attention, and I'll see you on the next one.